machines think like people? And it's I'm not going to give you my opinion, actually. I know Ronnie asked me to. It's mainly a survey of perspectives that we've seen over the years. And we won't come to a conclusion, unfortunately. But what we will do, hopefully, is give people a way of understanding what it all means. So when you see things achieving results, you'll say, well, this fits into this category or this category which we've seen before and has been described by some great people in the past. So I propose to consider the question, can machines think? And this should begin with the definition of machine and think. Now, these aren't my words. These are the words of computer pioneer Alan Turing, and he wrote them in a paper called Computing, Machinery and Intelligence in 1950. That's almost 75 years ago. And this was actually a pivotal paper, and actually still is the seminal paper on this subject, even after all these years. Even though there's lots changed, it's still actually the paper that contains the structure and the objections to the argument. It's the paper that we're going to track to. This was quite late in Turing's career, 1950. It was 1936 that he produced his paper on Turing machines and discussed the limits of computation. In 48, he produced a short paper called Intelligent Machinery, which I think led to this much, much more detailed paper. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back to this in a minute. We're going to take a sort of a historical detour on some of the issues, and we'll be returning mainly to his test of intelligence, which is still, I think, their most robust test, or not sufficient going forward, as you'll see, and the objections that he raised. Turing actually didn't invent the term artificial intelligence. That was invented at an informal meeting of these gentlemen, some of the absolute greats of computer science, amongst which were people like Claude Shannon, who went on to invent information theory, and Marvin Minsky, who created the foundations of neural nets. And it's a bit shame I can't name all of them because there's lots of people, and some not in this picture. They gathered together in Dartmouth summer research project in New Hampshire in 1955, a year after Turing's death. And these guys, it was quite, I'm sure at the time it was quite an innocuous small meeting for some people, but in retrospect, it was a foundational set of meeting, and these people sort of became the rock stars of computer science. And they came up with the term artificial intelligence. But they also ended with this sentence as part of their output. They said that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. This was a very bold claim to make in 1955, when the entire computing capacity of the world was way, like millions of times less than your phone at that point. So, it was a very bold claim. It's actually the start of a series of bold and frankly over-optimistic claims that we've seen from the AI community. Even to this day, we see those sorts of claims coming forward. But nevertheless, it was an important stake in the ground right from day one that people said, no, this is what we're trying to achieve. Exactly on the same day they invented the term artificial intelligence. But the first question we have to ask is it even a valid question to ask? Can machines think? Because philosophers have this thing they call a category mistake, which is a question that can't be answered because it shouldn't be asked. And there's lots of people who think that can machines think is a category mistake. Can a submarine swim? This is an odd question to ask, and it was a question that was posed by Noam Chomsky when he was asked whether computers can think. It's nonsensical to ask that because the submarines swim, but not in the way that you mean it to mean. So it's kind of a category error to be asking the question in the first place, according to Chomsky. Richard Feynman asked things like, can a plane fly, and can we run faster than a cheetah? And here he wasn't just aping what Chomsky had said. He was actually saying something quite subtly special, which is, yes, planes can fly, but they don't fly by flapping their wings. And yes, we can go faster than cheetahs only because we've invented roads and wheels. So he was saying that asking these questions is what we call anthropomorphic. It's a human-centered way of thinking about thinking. It's a very limited by human experience, and you shouldn't think about things that way. That's why when I wrote my presentation, I asked the question, can machines think like people? I added the words like people. Turing just said, can machines think? Because machines may be able to think, but the question we're thinking is, do they think like us? Which is a different question, slightly specialized question from what Turing was asking. Feynman also said this sentence: knowing is not the same as understanding. It's actually a very important sentence. It's a throwaway line from a genius like Feynman, but we'll come on to it a number of times in the presentation. And now you've read it, it should be fairly obvious to you where that plays out, even in some of the devices we have today. All right, so if we're saying that people think in a certain way, and it's maybe limiting to ask whether machines think like people, what are thinking agents? What other agents are there? Well, people is obviously one. We know that people think. Do all people think the same way? Do I think the same way as you think? Do people think to the same capacity? We have different intelligence levels, but it's hard to say really. We don't really interact with other people enough to know how other people are thinking. But mammals, all mammals think. They show the behavior of thinking. High order mammals show quite complicated behaviors like emotions and moods. So we think that mammals probably think in a very similar way to we do. And a random selection of non-mammalian creatures also think. Octopuses seem to have a consciousness, and ravens can do very complicated puzzles. But they seem to be sort of out of kilter with some of the other parts of their family tree, their animal tree. But ants and insects also think, but not in the way that humans and mammalians think. They think at a colony level. So whilst we can't say an individual ant is thinking about what it's doing, the collection of ants together does seem to have some what we call systemic thinking about it. There seems to be some systemic model of thinking. And this idea of systemic thinking will actually become quite important later on in the discussion about whether you need individual brains to be thinking or whether groups of things can be thinking. But all of these things we've talked about all live in the same family tree of life that evolved on Earth, whereas computers and aliens are not part of that family tree. So when we talk about thinking in this space, it's all really part of the same model of thinking, the same cerebral neural, but computers might think in a completely different way, and it might be limiting for them to think in our way, and aliens might think in a different way. They might not think in the same way we do. What's happening to my slides? What is it like to be a bat? This might seem like a strange question, but it's actually a very important question, and it was asked by the philosopher Thomas Nagel. We know what it's like to behave like a bat. We have good models of that. We know what the anatomy of a bat is. We know what the genetics of a bat is. But do we know what it's like to be a bat? To be this kind of blind, sonar-led creature? Nagel was clear that humans do not have the cognitive structures to comprehend the experiential life of a bat. We can't bring that into our mind. We just don't have sufficient structure. We can't encompass in a cognitive way the life of bat. The bats are always going to be separate from people. We don't know how bats think. Their thought patterns may be very, very different to ours. And when we think about what it's like to be a bat, you might think what it's like to sort of hang upside down in a cave and shout at the wall. That's you imposing an anthropomorphic model onto bats. And this question is what it's like to be a bat will keep cropping up, as we'll see. A very important question from Nagel. So if we think about intelligence in a kind of a pyramid, where at the bottom of this animal world pyramid, whereas at the bottom perhaps we have insects, and then maybe higher up bats and birds, and eventually we get to mammals, and eventually we get to us, and there we are sitting on the top of this intelligence pyramid, thinking very big thoughts and having very proud of ourselves. But it's actually a bit of hubris to think it ends there. It might actually go on. There might be higher levels of intelligence which we don't have the cognitive capacity to reach. And it may well be the case that computers and aliens and others might live in this other space. They may think differently from us and have a higher level of ability to produce cognitive material, as well. So this is what we call the idea of superhuman or transhuman intelligence. And this is where we get notions of things like an AI singularity, which I won't go too much into. And as an example, you can probably think quite clearly in 3D, I hope. You can probably think a little bit in 4D, but can you think in 100D? You can't. You don't have the cognitive capacity to be able to think in 100 dimensions. It's just nothing in your brain that you can reach for to help you understand that. You can understand a mathematical matrix, which is 100 by 100, but you can't understand what it's like to be in that. You can only think temporally in one direction. You can only think from cause to effect. If I ask you to think backwards, you can't do that. There's nothing to say that computers can't think backwards in time in 100 dimensions. So they may be living in a space outside of our intelligence level eventually. But anyway, let's not worry too much about, for a moment, other types of thinking. Let's just think about humans, because we're actually asking ourselves a narrow question. Can they think like us? Okay, so how do we think? What is our process of thinking? Well, it all centers around this gray matter, which we have in our head. And actually, it took a long time for people to understand that this is the center of thinking. Egyptians used to think that the brain was just like a heat sink for the body, and they used to, when they're embalming pharaohs, they used to sort of suck it out through the nose and throw it into a bucket because they thought it wasn't important. But it was actually Aristotle who first came up with a model that said that the brain is the center of thinking and reasoning. But he also thought that the heart was the seat of moral judgment, and the gut was the seat of basal sort of emotions, hunger and lust and things like that. And although we now understand that not to be true, that it's all in the brain, we still use that language. We say we have a gut instinct, or we believe something with our heart, or we say sometimes there's a battle between our heart and our head. So we still use that language from Aristotle. But clearly it's all actually in the brain. And after hundreds of years of study by hundreds and hundreds of people who I can't call out in my little people call outs because there's too many of them, we've come to the conclusion that the human brain is a hellishly complicated affair. It's some kind of chemical machine. It's running over some biological structure. And interestingly for us, it displays what we call localization. There's small specific task modules designed to do one thing well, scattered all over the brain. And when information comes in, these modules do one thing, sometimes in serial and pass it on to another, sometimes in parallel. And they all run heuristic, sort of fairly random rules of thumb to decide whether something is, some thought should occur or not. So when you, and some of these are very low level decisions, some of them are very high level decisions. So for instance, vision doesn't get processed in one part of the brain like a vision part. It gets sent simultaneously to many parts of the brain. So your lower level reptilian style brains will look at something and they will instantly form things like fear or disgust or lust over what it's seeing way before other parts of the brain will catch up. It'll go to a kind of a memory recovery system somewhere else to see whether you've seen it before. It's actually quite late that it will arrive in the cortical thinking parts of the brain. So by the time you're thinking about it, you've already actually formed quite a lot of basal judgments about what's going on. Bringing things into the thinking part of your brain actually isn't always a good idea. It can actually sometimes get in the way. When you're driving a car, you're not really thinking about what you're doing. You're working at a lower motor level, perceptual level of your brain, and you're driving along. If while you're driving along, I ask you to accurately describe exactly what you're doing, which they do in a driving test in the UK, it actually becomes quite difficult because what you've done is you force driving into the cortex areas of your thinking brain. And that works slowly, it's complicated, it's energy consuming. So thinking about things only happens in a very small part of the brain. Your brain is not thinking in the way that we mean a lot of the time. It's reacting to a lot of things. Language is a big player here. I haven't got time to go with where language is all over the brain, but there's so much we don't know about the brain. We're really at almost square one. We don't know where consciousness is. We don't know where emotion is. We don't know where creativity and enjoyment and disgust and love is in this complicated thing. We are actually at the beginnings of having a much better understanding of these things, because now, for the first time ever, we can actually watch a brain live while it performs certain operations. So I'm sure we'll see a lot of improvements in our understanding of the brain, but we don't know a lot about the brain. Let's just be honest about it. And the brain itself is also very brittle. We've obviously seen AI being very brittle, but the brain is brittle. You can easily fool the brain with simple illusions because the brain is an ensemble of smaller machines all working together. You can fool one part of the machine while the other parts of the machine know they're being fooled. So if I show you one of many optical illusions, parts of your brain will look at that and think it's sensible. Other parts, the cortical parts, the thinking parts, will look at it and say, well, I know that can't ever be because it's not a structure that makes sense. But your brain can simultaneously hold these kind of thoughts because your brain isn't one thing, it's multiple things all working together. If you look at this image long enough, eventually it'll fall into a two-dimensional shape, and then it might fall back out into a three-dimensional shape. And that's because different parts of your brain are perceiving it differently and they're fighting for attention. So your brain isn't sort of one thing. Also, the brain is, because it has this area of localization and different parts of the brain are doing different things, if you get damage to a local part of the brain, you get a different type of outcome called an aphasia. And it really shows you how complicated the brain is. A bronchius aphasia, if you get damage in the bronchial area of the brain, means that you can still form you can still form sentences, but your sentences will lack any grammar. You find it hard to form grammatical sentences. In fact, you're almost definitely assigned to nouns and verbs only. Even adjectives and connectives are hard to find. Whereas if you get a damage in the Wernicke area and you get Wernicke's aphasia, then you form perfectly sounding sentences, but they mean nothing. They're meaning-free sentences. The most interesting one I find is something called dissociative disorder, where you can't recognize things you're shown, but if I ask you to draw them, you can draw them. So the brain itself is a complicated set of instruments and is also very brittle. A key experiment is a split brain experiment. The brain is actually in two hemispheres, and there is a connective tissue between them so they know what each other is doing. But for various reasons I won't go into, you can split the brain in half so the two areas work independently of each other and have no connection. When you split a brain, and if you're interested in the mechanics, we can talk about it later. When you split a brain, you can talk to the left hand brain and the right hand separately using a particular technique. You can ask a person to do something on the left hand side of the brain, and then you can ask the right hand side of the brain why they did it. And what we see there is something called narrative consciousness. The brain, the right hand side of the brain, makes up a reason. Like if I tell the left hand half of the brain to open a window and then I ask the right hand why you did it, it'll say because I was cold, even though that's not true. It's called the many minds hypothesis, and they compete for consciousness and they compete for intentionality. And it really brings into question the idea about whether we actually have free will or not, or whether the brain is just doing, there's other examples of free will challenging things inside the brain. Okay, so that's the brain, but there's another thing inside the brain that we need to talk about, because inside the brain is the mind. And somewhere inside the brain is the mind. And somewhere inside the mind, is yourself. So there's a kind of complicated layering here which we don't fully understand the mechanics of. If you're a religious person, you might think that somewhere inside yourself is your soul. And there was a lot of debate about this amongst the philosophers, but we won't be going into that part of it today. So the brain contains a mind, and the mind contains you somehow. And this mind-body problem was first described by René Descartes. René realized that there's a mental world and a physical world, and these two worlds are actually separate and disjoint from each other. The mental world forms a picture of the physical world within itself, but the mental world is massless. It has no mass, but it does have a causal effect on the physical world. And René, in very extensive, much more extensive than I have, called out the differences between the mind and the body and the mental and the physical world. And in the modern language, this has a great play onto a software-hardware play. René said that the mental world has to manifest itself somehow in the physical world, which is a bit like me saying the software has to manifest itself on hardware. Okay, software runs on hardware, the mind runs on the brain, is the way we think about these things. Now, not everybody agreed with Descartes. A lot of people disagree with him. There's an idea of what's called physicalism, which is to say that actually there must be a physical structure in the brain for every mental structure in the mind, but that's unresolved. But it doesn't actually stop at the brain. because well, Descartes stopped at the brain, but later on people said, well, hold on, the brain is being fed information by senses, and senses are part of a body, and the body is living in a world. So there's a much more sort of holistic view of here. And John Locke and other sort of empiricist philosophers said that, realized that the mind can only get an indirect understanding of what's happening in the world via the senses and the body. So the mind is tied to the bodily experience. And Locke was saying you can't separate the mind from the senses and the body. It doesn't make sense. They're all one thing. And you have to consider them as an entire system, and you can't consider them separately. This is going to be very important, as we'll see later, because AI is mostly a mind. And we're sort of back to bats again, where bats aren't just a mind. They've got odd senses, they've got sort of sound-based senses, and they have a body. And when we think about what it means to be a bat, we're not thinking about its mind, we're thinking holistically about the experiential level of a bat. So it comes on to the whole thing. There is a very important mind experiment here called Plato's Cave, which looking at the time we don't go into, but it's interesting to look up if you have time. Now, when we talk about AI, we're really talking about a mind. We're building a mind with AI. When we have robots, then we're talking about senses and bodies as well. And it's important to understand the distinction. When I have a WebEx meeting like we're having now, you're interacting with my mind, okay? It's a meeting of minds, and it's a partial meeting of senses, and it's no meeting of the body. If we could all come to Bedfont Lakes and have this meeting together there, then it would be a meeting of the full body. And some people think that this is why creativity doesn't happen very well over the media we're using now, and why you need a full whole body experience for creativity to be firing. But you know, that's obviously a big topic in itself. So that kind of leads us into a topic called cognitivism. And cognitivism, well, let's start with this sentence. When a man reasons, by the way, all these quotes use the word man, obviously slightly, not PC these days. So, but anyway, they're historical quotes. When a man reasons, he does nothing more than conceive a sum total of additional particles. Now, this came from a very early Enlightenment philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, who basically thought the world was made up, all knowledge was made up of basic atoms of information, and that they were like syntactical forms, and that when people thought, all they were doing was combining these basic things into strands, and that's what the root of human reason and thinking was, this kind of particles of knowledge. And this was picked up quite aggressively later on by Leibniz. Leibniz, incredible man, I don't know if you know much about it, but he basically thought that every thought we ever had can be divided into particles of knowledge. And then he went ahead and said, well, I'm going to build that thing, and he called it the Characteristica Universalis. And he said that we can build a catalogue of all the facts that ever were, and then we can also map the relationships between those facts in a single and consistent model. And he went on to produce a kind of visual representation of that model, and you can see he had lots of fun drawing these little icons and links. Obviously, this is beyond the capability of somebody born in his time, but nevertheless, what an amazing thing to be thinking. This is what we call a knowledge graph in modern times, and you know, Leibniz generally thought that if you started the Characteristica Universalis and generations picked it up, that eventually we'd end up with all the facts that ever were in an interlocked, consistent model. And Wittgenstein, much later on, by the way, nobody else worked on this after Leibniz died, but Wittgenstein, much later on, did pick it up in his Tractus Logo Philosophicus, because he believed that, but he formalized it very much more clearly. He basically said that all the world's knowledge, everything that's ever happened, is part of a system of formal primitives. And he went on to define quite in detail the structure of how these primitives can be captured. And he was, because he was born in the 20th century, he was the first one to say that if we can give a computer a sufficient number of these formal primitives, it will become like us and start thinking. If you give the computer enough facts and relationships, that thinking and perhaps even consciousness would naturally appear in the system. It would be an emergent property of a mass of formal primitives. Now, remember back to what we said about systemic intelligence in the ant colony. He's kind of drawing an analogy here that if we can just build a big enough colony of facts, that somehow within that, consciousness and thinking, or thinking at least, but perhaps consciousness would naturally appear as a kind of emergent property. Now, all these gentlemen, Leibniz, Hobbes, and Wittgenstein, were philosophers, although Wittgenstein is borderline a mathematician as well. But let's bring this into computation, because what happened was all that work was eventually picked up by computer scientists. First, in 1943, a long time ago, it was picked up by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts, and they produced this paper called A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in the Nervous Activity. And Pitts and McCulloch actually tried to encapsulate the neural activity in brain cells in a human mind and map those onto logic gates within a computer. And their assertion, which was not proven in their paper, but the track they were going along, is that we can take a human brain, we can map what it's doing into logical circuits, and we can build it a universal Turing machine out of it, the Turing machine, the model of computation that Turing put on in 1936, that it's possible to reductively reduce a human brain to those states. Actually, not much happened with their paper after 1943. For a long time, until 1976, when Alan Newell, a computer scientist and cognitivist, and Herbert Simon picked it up. And they produced a system, a very influential system, called Physical Systems Hypothesis. Newell and Simon said that minds are simply processing symbolic representations of information, that they're doing it in a deterministic way and hence in a computable way. And as long as you can isolate these symbolic representations, you can transfer that human mind into another medium. And they went on to describe in a lot of detail how those symbolic representations are to be produced. They went on to produce quite detailed representations of those. But their view was that once you capture sufficient of those, you can release the mind from the brain, as it were. And they had this idea of multiple realizations, that you can certainly run a mind in a neural sense, as we know, but you can also run it on silicon. And for that matter, you can make a giant steampunk machine that is a mind, as long as you can build one big enough, because of this disassociation between the physical system representation that's running and the brain itself. A bit like being able to run a spreadsheet anywhere, you know, the same spreadsheet, different. Now, this is what cognitivism is. The cognitivism, all this group of people are living a space we now call cognitivism, which is the mind is what you need, and that's all you need. And within that, there's an even more diehard group called functionalists, who basically say that software should never be tied to hardware and the mind should never be tied to the brain. Now, that obviously gets us closer to computers thinking. Now, you might think this is all pie in the sky, but all these people's work actually what led to rules-based systems, expert systems, Tim Berners-Lee's semantic web, ontological data processing. We use these technologies all day, every day. It's used all over the place. And this is a direct result of the works of all these gentlemen, actually, and all the work they did to put together. But they don't have it their own way, because lots of people disagreed with them. The anti-formalists. There are no parts of meaning, as meaning cannot be detached from experience, said Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was a very, very staunch rejecter of the formalist approaches, along with all his friends in the camp of existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and others. They said that you can only think of whole sensory, bodily, conscious experiences together. There is no separation of mind and brain, of mind and senses, and of mind of body. It's a system and can only be treated as a system. And thinking can only happen across the set. Heidegger gave a thought experiment called the Red Rose Dilemma, which was about a person who's been brought up in a grey, colourless room all their life and has never experienced colour. Yet becomes the world's expert in color because they have all the textbooks about what color is and the frequency of light, and actually are being consulted by people when issues of color arise, but they never themselves have experienced color. And then one day somebody gives them a red rose. And Heidegger says that if you believe the cognitivists, nothing happens when they give them red. Nothing should change. But if you're a non-formalist, everything changes because it's experiential things that lead to thinking. Now, mathematics, we might say that formalism or non-formalism in a kind of cognitive sense is a debate, but in mathematics, surely it's not a debate. Mathematics is formal. It must be formal. Mathematics can be built up from a series of axioms. Addition gives us repeated addition gives us multiplication, addition gives us subtraction, subtraction gives us division, and we can slowly build up the whole of maths through a series of axioms. And that's what this gentleman, David Hilbert, was doing in his program called Hilbert's Axioms. He was rebuilding maths in the mid-19th century, mid-20th century, rebuilding maths on a basis of firm set of axioms, and everything was going to be great. We'd already seen this creaking in other parts, which I won't go into, but everything was going to be good. But Hilbert's program not only was compromised, it was completely and utterly blown away in a stunning way by this paper, which introduced Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Kurt Gödel mathematically proved that no system can completely describe itself, not even mathematics. He proved that there are true statements in maths which can never be proven within maths. You have to leave the system to prove them. That systems cannot completely describe themselves. It's very hard in this short presentation to say that how he proved that. He didn't, it was not, this is not a conjecture. He proved it mathematically that the system, the maths itself can never be complete. In fact, no system can be self-describing in that sense. It took people several decades to understand the implications of this. John von Neumann was actually one of the first people who really understood what this meant. It really is quite devastating to a whole bunch of people, including the cognitivists, because on paper, it means that no deterministic system can lead to a conscious model, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Gödel himself was terribly depressed by his own finding. It really depressed the hell out. He spent the rest of his career trying to prove himself wrong, and he eventually starved himself to death, which is quite sad. Okay, so we spoke early on about this idea of information and relationships between information and falling sort of knowledge graphs and capturing, and that all led to, as we said, expert systems and knowledge-based systems and ontologies and good stuff like that. But in the 1980s, another bunch of people came along, led mainly by Minsky and others, called the Connectivists, and they realized that actually, rather than just focusing on the nodes, if we focus on the nodes and the links, the information and the relationships together, and we have these connective graphs to build intelligence, that we can actually make big leaps. And they did make big leaps. And they built systems based on what we now call neural nets, which is a loose analogy for the connections in the human mind, the synapses and the dendrites, what Minsky called perceptrons. And they went on to build these kind of neural nets and deep neural nets and knowledge graphs and things like that. And these led to machine learning, where the graph is being learned from experience of earlier data. And this has been a huge boon, because this is what has led to the stunning results that we see happening when we look at what AI is achieving today. It's mainly using this connectivist approach, not the earlier cognitive approaches, although the two can work together. They increasingly are being brought together. It can be quite brittle. It can be quite narrow, solving one problem only, but as we've seen, the brain is made up of a series of narrow, brittle things which come together in a system. And it does require huge amounts of training material to get going. But when it works, it really works. And that's what we're seeing the results from the cognitivist approach. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that machine learning is an analog for human learning. It's not. It's not at all. If we ask a computer to transcribe some text, it will see raster images or perhaps vectors and lines. It will break the letters up into those vectors, and it will push it through its experience of other vectors and lines, and it will come to a determination of what the letters are. But when a human reads it, let's say it's a shopping list, you can't process the information that way. The only way you could do it is if I cut up the letters and showed them to you one by one. You will instantly know it's a shopping list While you're doing it, you'll form a judgment about what's on the list. You'll think about if, has this family got children, how well off they are they eating different foods to you? That's because when you learn, you learn semantically through high-level semantics, but computers are learning through a narrow set of statistics. Can statistics lead to semantics? If there's enough of them, will that automatically mean that semantics becomes emergent? This was the kind of cognitive dilemma that we saw earlier. It's unproven, but certainly statistics and semantics is a different way of thinking about the world. Okay, so this is all that was a detour, and we're going to come back to Turing's paper now. Now, how do we know if something is thinking? How do we know if a machine is thinking? Now, Turing proposed a model for doing that, which he called the imitation game, but which later on we've called the Turing test. In a Turing test, what happens is that humans and computers or machines are put into different isolated rooms, and there's no way of seeing inside the room what they are. And an interrogator speaks to them via text, not via speech, although sometimes in later tests now it's via speech in what's called true modality tests. And then the interrogator tries to work out if the agent they're speaking to is a human or is a machine. And Turing said that if you can fool 30% of the people in a 5-minute discussion, then it's thinking. Okay, that was his test of thinking. So you might say, well, hold on, there's been a bit of a burden shift here, because now you've shifted the burden from the agent is thinking to the agent is exhibiting thinking behavior. So you've shifted it from the thinker to the observer. And what you've said is the appearance of thinking is good enough, that external appearances are more important than internal processes. Can't you more directly test for intelligence? Well, how are you going to do that? Well, you can do IQ tests or abstract reasoning tests. There's common sense reasoning tests. There's something called the Winograd scheme, which is for doing that. But actually, machines can solve this kind of stuff easier than people. It's not really a test of thinking. It's pattern matching and heuristics and things like that. So machines can do that. So in fact, how do you know anything's thinking? From your perspective, from your mind, how do you know anything's thinking? How do you know I'm thinking? How do you know you're not a mind floating in a vat of liquid in an episode of Star Trek? You can't really know. All you have to go on is your own experiential view of the world. Your mind is locked in your brain, and your brain has senses in the body. In fact, what Turing realized is that human discourse is the only way you can really understand, because human discourse is an ultimate test. It contains all the subtle vagaries of human life, tangential discussions, off-topic remark, the inconsistencies and the flaws in who we are and how we use language. It's difficult to know what's happening inside another agent unless you interrogate that agent, and then you can only bring that into your mind. So the Turing test is what we're left with, and the Turing test is what we use. Although we've changed it over time, one of the things we've added is this idea of surprise, which is called the Lovelace addendum, which is to say that the agent should be able to surprise us and surprise its creator by doing things which are hard to explain. And we've also added things like sensible and specific goals, which is to say that it has to say things which are sensible in the context of what we're talking about, and it has to be specific. You can't just keep saying, well, I don't know much about that topic, or oh, I'm not sure about that, as we often see. Evasive terms. So Turing actually listed his own objections to this being a good test and this being thinking, and Turing's objections are actually still pretty complete. We can still track to them. Turing listed 3 what I call minor objections. He didn't call them minor, which is objections based on religion, objections based upon limitations. We say, well, I've never seen a computer do this or that, which just gets smaller and smaller over time, or a head in the sand to say, isn't the kind of question we should ever ask ourselves anyway. So let's skip over those, although Turing goes into those quite deeply. The first major objection is mathematical, and it's not only a major one, it's the biggest one by far, and it's based upon the work of Gödel, and it was picked up by John Lucas and Roger Penrose in what was called the Lucas-Penrose argument. It is the most convincing and devastating argument. It's very hard to confute, but it's not an attack on thinking, it's an attack on machine consciousness. It uses Gödel's theory to show that a formal system, and the computers are formal systems, conscious agents cannot emerge from those deterministic systems, that it's impossible from a Gödel model for that to happen. Some people try and argue against it. I don't think it's hard to argue against it. It looks pretty convincing, I think, for me, and I think it's still, if it's a closed deterministic system, it cannot become conscious unless Gödel is wrong. It's hard to describe why that's the case without going too much into it. But actually, they're not talking about thinking, they're talking about consciousness, so maybe there's still some hope. There's something else called the Ada-Lovelace, let me just dismiss this, sorry. There's something else called the Ada-Lovelace conjecture, which is that, oh gosh, hold on, Duo has popped up to say my email is, I used to verify my email. Okay, so the Ada-Lovelace conjecture is that machines can't go beyond their programming. They can't do things beyond what they were learnt, that they're limited to rehash and recombine old knowledge. They can't ever become creative or have new thinking or new ideas. This was the Lovelace conjecture. Take, for instance, a hypothetical world I find myself in where I'm the only person who's ever heard the Beatles songs. You may have seen the film. For a while, I can be a very creative person. I can be the most musically creative person in the world. But it isn't going to help me once I run out of those Beatles songs, because I can't rehash anything new. I can't move beyond that. So the unproven conjecture is that machines can't move beyond learning. They can do surprising things, but if you drill into it, it's really a recombination of earlier things. But perhaps that's true of humans too. Could J.K. Rowling's worlds have existed if Tolkien hadn't have been? And would Tolkien have existed if the Greek tragedies hadn't have been? Perhaps we're all just doing that. But there is an idea of what we call consensus breaking. Individuals who pop up, who smash the consensus and think about things in different ways. Mozart, Einstein, and others, Turing for that matter. And then there's lots of other objections which I'm going to skirt over. One is about consciousness. One is to say, well, you can't have thinking without consciousness, but then that's troublesome because we know, for instance, that frogs aren't conscious because we can show that frogs do stupid non-conscious things, but no one's saying frogs aren't thinking. Sparrows, again, show non-conscious behavior when they are feeding cuckoos at the expense of their own younglings, but no one's saying that sparrows aren't thinking. So consciousness and thinking seems to be separate, and it seems like you can have one without the other. Some people say that brains are analog and you can't have thinking in a digital world, but if that's true, then I should be able to build a brain using water, and that would be thinking. So that seems not quite right there, so I can't just say it's just the analog. And some people say, well, deterministic systems only lead to predictable behavior and can't have free will. But as we know, we're not even sure if people have free will. So these arguments sort of break down too. Let's finally look at two interesting experiments which try to come to terms with this. One's called the brain prothesis experiment, and it was proposed by Hans Moravec. Let's say that we can completely break down a human mind. Like we know every single brain cell, every single synapse, and every single dendrite in there. And slowly, not all at once, slowly, one by one, we take each one of those and we make it an electronic component. And we replace it with an electronic component over time. And we do that, say, let's say one every second, and there's billions to do, so it will take years to achieve. Moravec asks, what is the lived experience of that mind whilst that's happening, and where does it end up as that mind started being entirely biological and ended up being entirely electronic? Now, if you believe the cognitivists, nothing changes. The mind should not realize there's been a change. The world should continue, and the slow transition from biology to electronics should happen without the mind realizing or understanding that anything has happened. But if you believe the anti-formalists, what they would see is you would see a gradual loss of consciousness and a gradual loss of things like creativity, emotion, etc. as you went by. So you might still end up with a machine that is knowing, but not a machine that's understanding, and that you'd see a gradual loss as time went by. A little bit like that final scene in 2001 where Dave is pulling the circuits out of Hal, and one by one the machine is regressing to a non-thinking machine. Finally, let's deal with this guy. This is by far the biggest test the biggest sort of counter-argument to machine thinking there's been, and it was called the Chinese Room. It was proposed by John Searle in the 1980s, I think. John imagined a room, a closed room called the Chinese Room, and this room was closed off from the outside world except for two things, an input and an output. And native Chinese speakers fed questions on tape in Cantonese or Chinese into the room, and answers came out of the output on the other side. And they might imagine then there is a thinking entity in the room. But inside the room, there is simply a person who can't speak a word of Chinese and can't understand the symbols, but has got sufficient books and rules to know what to do. So the person looks at the message, looks up, not the words, not what they mean, they're not translating it into English. They look up, oh, this symbol means I replace it with that symbol, etc. And they just have a sufficient body of material to transform one tape to the other without them ever understanding what's written on the page. Obviously, you'd need a big set of books and it would take a bit of time. But Searle was saying that externally, you might think that the machine has a thinking entity, but there is no thinking here. It is simply a process that's being run by an unthinking agent. Computers lead to formalism, which is syntax, which is knowing, but the mind is mental, which leads to semantics, which is understanding. And syntax and semantics are not the same, is what Searle said, and that we shouldn't mess them up and we should think about them separately. Lots of people have tried to refute Searle. There's lots of refutations of that. The most important one is what's called the systems refutation, which is to say, well, the lady here isn't thinking, but the machine, the whole system together is thinking, the lady plus the books plus the process, which takes us back to the ant colony. But Searle's response to that is, well, what if the lady memorized all the books? Okay, she memorized the whole thing. Now it's all taking part in her head, but she's still not thinking. She's still running a process. So it's quite a difficult one. Are we there yet? So we're running out of time. Let me go quickly. What did Turing think of it all? Well, Turing came to the conclusion that thinking machines are not a contradiction. Okay, that was his thinking. But to be fair to Turing, it was a long time ago, and a lot has happened since then. And one thing's clear is the test that he put in place, important as it was, and the fundamental shift to the observer is important, but it's not sufficient going forward. And that's because of things like this. So this is ChatGPT, and this is a question, write a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge. Now this question is an example question that Turing put in his paper. Okay, and he fudged the answer. He gave a non-specific, I don't know what that means. But look, this is what happens if you ask ChatGPT that question. It produces a beautiful sonnet. Now, if I told you a high school student had done this, you would not be surprised to say they are thinking. They would have thought about Scotland and the fourth bridge and what it means to the Scottish people, and they would have thought about the structure of a sonnet, and they would have had a high degree of skill to have brought together such a beautiful sonnet about the fourth bridge. So you wouldn't have any sort of doubt that this was the results of a thinking entity. But I can go further. I said to ChatGPT, can you give me a subtle underlying socialist message? And it changed the poem, and it said, oh, built by the hands of workers who labored hard with blood and sweat, you know, showing solidarity and by the people for the people. So it turned it, so, and again, I said, well, can you give me a capitalist spin? And then it said, well, people who took a risk and invested and showed that the power of individualism and through competition they were able to show. It would be very hard for people to look at this and to say it doesn't pass a Turing test. Clearly it passes those kinds of tests. I think those tests are not sufficient going forward. So let's say we were lucky enough to gather all these wonderful people into a room and show them ChatGPT. What would they say? Well, Turing and Lovelace would say, look, it's passed the test. It's passed the test with all the addendums that we put in place afterwards. Leibniz and Wittgenstein would say, look, thinking has emerged through a mass of formal primitives. You've given ChatGPT so many formal primitives that thinking has emerged as a natural emergent property of that. Maybe basic thinking at this stage, but they would be clear that this machine is thinking through the mass of formal primitive it's been given. Chomsky would be saying, no, this whole premise is still a category error. Why are you asking if ChatGPT is thinking? It's an incorrect categorization to even ask that question because it's not a human. Feynman would say, well, it knows a lot, but it understands nothing. And so that, which is another type of category mistake, he would say. The computer sciences, McCulloch, Pitts, Newell, and Simon would feel very vindicated by what's happening here. They would feel very happy that the process they put in place are working, robust, and proving results. Edward Minsky, who possibly still can, because he's alive, can say that the systems that he put in place are working and are delivering great results. But oddly, the computer scientists probably don't have a lot to say about whether the machine is thinking, just that the processes they put in place are working the way they expected them to work. Heidegger would be very cross. He would say it's non-experiential, it's unthinking, it's a blind statistical parrot, if you like, just parroting out things without understanding. It has no experience of these things. Lucas and Penrose would say, well, whatever it is, it's clearly not a conscious entity. They would say maybe you can say it's thinking, but it can't be consciously aware of what it's doing. And Searle would say, look, this is a perfect example of a Chinese room. It's being fed a signal, it's running a series of rules that it doesn't really understand, and it's giving you an output. So Searle would also feel very vindicated by it, and I think it proves his point. What would Turing say? Turing, I don't know what he would say, and it's not really mine to put words in his mouth, but perhaps he would say it doesn't matter. If it has the appearance of thinking, shouldn't we perhaps just treat it as if it were thinking? Eventually, people will just come to terms with these things and might even prefer them to be their helpers, their colleagues, their friends, or even their lovers. Does it matter that it's thinking in a non-human way? Is that really relevant? I don't know. I mean, they're my words, not Alan's, but let's assume that he would say something like that. So finally, let me leave you with these 36 words. So these 36 words here, which were put together by this gentleman 400 years ago, sitting in a candlelit room in Bishopsgate in London, not far from the Cisco office, they speak to us in a number of different ways. First of all, clearly it's a really beautiful musing on the mystery and the majesty of the sort of human condition, as we'd expect from Shakespeare. But more importantly, a human constructed these words without prompting, and strangely just managed to pluck the creativity of these words out of the air through a process we don't understand, was working on training material of all the poets that went before him. But nevertheless, there does seem to be something special about the way humans can construct beautiful things like this, which live through the ages. And although I may be falling into what's called the limitations dilemma, it seems like there is still a gap here in terms of the intentionality and the non-promptedness of the ability to make sort of beautiful statements like this as a human. So that's it. So that's my survey.